Hello, my name is Dr. Mary Beth Carlberg. I'm a retired family practice doctor in Central New York. I'll be talking about the environmental impacts of food and agriculture. And what keeps me awake at night is worrying about my children and grandchildren's future. And let's face it, there's a lot of bad news. We are told we have until the early 2030s, that's 10 years, to meet our 1.5 degree goal. And apparently, we are way off target. Emissions continue to rise as infrastructure for fossil fuels and our consumer demands continue to expand. 2021 was the second biggest emissions rise ever. The United States is now the world's largest exporter of liquid natural gas, and we continue to permit new oil and gas exploration. Oil and gas are subsidized globally $6 trillion in 2020. Coal-fired electricity reached an all-time high in 2021. China has 80 new coal plants in the works, and the global demand for meat is increasing. Two thoughts keep recurring in my head. A climate professor at Cornell spoke. People talk about 2 degrees warming a lot of times, he said. And well, what's the big deal about 2-degree warming? It seems like it was 2 degrees warmer today than it was yesterday, and I'm not dying. But in Ithaca, 15,000 years ago, there was an ice age, and we had 4 kilometers of ice on top of our heads. That was a 4-degree cooling. And you can imagine in your mind what a 4-degree warming would be. So these are the numbers. 2 is safe. Anything above 2, we're going to start approaching something as crazy as 4 kilometers of ice over our head, except in the other direction, end quote. Unfortunately, experts at the World Meteorological Organization recently reported in May of 23 that global temperatures will likely breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark outlined in the Paris Climate Accord sometime in the next 5 years, with a more permanent arrival above 1.5 in the 2030s. This is extremely frightening news. The second thought is this. Here's our atmosphere. It's so thin that if you could drive a car straight up in the air at highway speed, you'd get to the top of that blue line in just 5 to 7 minutes, and all of the greenhouse gases would be below you. And yet we continue to emit greenhouse gases as though its capacity was limitless. Here's an interactive quiz in the New York Times from December of 2022. It was titled, "What's the best way to shrink your carbon footprint?" On the left were actions, then how big their effect was, and then the percent of 1,000 Americans who got it right. Interestingly, the more important it was, the less we seemed to be aware. Think of how we all relatively quickly jumped on the recycling bandwagon, especially plastic, and yet its effect on global warming, small. So, eating vegan has a large impact on emissions. How many of us are aware of diet's huge impact? Only 6% in this survey. And our food choices have impacts way beyond our carbon footprint. To clarify for today's talk, food includes all of agricultural industry, from clearing land to growing crops to raising livestock to getting it on your plate. 26% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. It's the second largest source of global greenhouse gas emissions. 50% of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture, and 78% of global ocean and freshwater eutrophication, which is algal blooms, is caused by agriculture. Animal agriculture is the largest global cause of unfathomable animal suffering. Agriculture disproportionately affects the world's poor by accelerating climate change with its associated droughts and floods and heat waves. It's a cause of pandemics, since overcrowded livestock spur viral mutations, and it often promotes human chronic diseases by favoring meat and dairy consumption over more healthy fruits and vegetables. It's the leading cause of habitat destruction and thus the main contributor to the 6th mass extinction scientists say that we are in, as 94% of the world's mammalian biomass and 71% of bird biomass is now livestock, and it's all interrelated. Quote, "A vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth," Not just greenhouse gases, but global acidification, eutrophication, land use, and water use. It is far bigger than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car, as these only cut greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is a sector that spans all the multitude of environmental problems. Really, it is animal products that are responsible for so much of this. End quote. That's from Joseph Poor, University of Oxford, who led research of 40,000 farms in 119 countries, the largest study to date on the environmental impact of foods. So, the biggest way we can reduce our harmful environmental impact is staring us in the face. Yes, eat less meat. The IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, those hundreds of scientists who advise the UN on all things climate, says, quote, diet change is vital to reduce climate impact, especially eating less meat, end quote. Note they say vital, not would be nice, not optional. Quote, whenever you model out having the world manage massive climate change, you pretty much have to build in dietary moderation for people in wealthy countries. No one can get there without that, end quote. We have a lot of work to do. But the great news is that we can drastically reduce these impacts created by our food choices. It's entirely in our hands. We, the consumer, you and I, drive agricultural demands immediately, substantively, 3 times a day, every day of our lives. To eat meat or not to eat meat? That is the question on which our very survival may depend. Quite a bold statement. Let's see if I can start to persuade you this is not as outlandish as it sounds. Let's check out agriculture's land effects first. Now, this is astonishing. About 3/4 of land on Earth is habitable, can be lived on. Of that land, almost half is used for agriculture. Of that agricultural land, 77% is devoted to growing crops for animal feed and grazing. Let me repeat that. It's not a typo. 3/4 of our agricultural land is used so that we can eat animals and their products. And yet, it supplies only 18% of our global calories. This graph shows the amount of land used by a food source for every 1,000 calories it produces. The main culprit is beef, followed by sheep, and then dairy products. All the top players are animal products, and all the lower are plants. 80% of deforestation in the Amazon is to raise cattle. By the way, the US is the #1 per capita consumer of beef in the world. So we can take credit for a good share of this. Why is deforestation and clearing all this land for animals and their rearing an issue? Let's look at 3 consequences of deforestation. First, deforestation for animal agriculture is the primary driver for habitat loss and extinction. Since 1980, we've lost 70% of all land animals that were on the planet. And in Southeast Asia, we've lost 90% of tropical forests just since 2000. Quote, the key is reducing meat consumption, end quote. Second, if all the world went vegan tomorrow, it would free up an area of land the size of North and South America combined. We could feed another 4 billion people, half the world's population. Third, carbon capture. We desperately need to stop cutting down our forests. We must preserve as much vegetation as we can to draw CO2 out of the air and trap it. Let's look at what a good job nature can do. Here's a National Geographic report showing NASA's emission simulations. The red is carbon dioxide. Notice 2 things. The first is that carbon dioxide emissions come almost exclusively from the northern hemisphere. This is April. The second is that massive amounts of carbon dioxide are absorbed seasonally by forests and other vegetation. As the model moves from late spring into summer, this is July, the rivers of red gas begin to fade away, drawn out of the atmosphere by photosynthesizing plants. This is September. Then, as the model slips into early winter, here's December, vegetation dies and goes dormant, and carbon dioxide flows back into the atmosphere. The Brazilian Amazon has been transformed by deforestation into a net carbon emitter rather than the massive sink it's always been. The whole of the Amazon is still a net sink, but teetering on the brink. So currently, there are two ways to get carbon out of the air: carbon capture technology and regreening the earth, which we just saw how wonderful a job nature can do if left to its own devices. Regarding technology that traps carbon dioxide, it turns out we're not that smart. After working on it for 50 years, we still haven't gotten it. Actually, not by a long shot. Al Gore pointed out, quote, "Right now, all around the world, if you look at all the carbon capture and sequestration products, what they capture is about 6 hours worth of emissions per year. So for them," he means the fossil fuel industry, "to say this is the future, well, probably not. Again, I hope there's a breakthrough, but we can't bet on it." End quote. In 1 year of operations, Iceland's newest carbon capture facility removes 3 seconds worth of yearly global emissions. Looking to carbon capture technology as a significant contributor to climate change is oil and gas's attempt to take our eyes off the prize and continue business as usual. Since CO2 lasts in the air for 10,000 years, the most important thing is not to let it get up there in the first place. Let's talk about that. Agriculture causes 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Again, it's the second leading cause of global warming. Animal agriculture causes 60% of these emissions. Included in animal agricultural emissions are everything from growing crops for feed to rearing livestock to its distribution in your supermarket. Most animal agricultural emissions are from, well, yes, I'm sorry, it was cow burps, filling the air with methane. Now consider that methane has 85 times the global warming effect as CO2 over a 20-year time frame. In fact, if cows were a nation, they would rank third after China and the United States for greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture also causes greenhouse gas emissions by using synthetic fertilizers. Again, keep in mind that 3/4 of agricultural land is growing crops to feed livestock. They contain nitrogen, and when they're applied, they release nitrous oxide into the air. And nitrous oxide is 265 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2. Also, making fertilizer is energy intensive. Stopping its use in the United States would be the equivalent of taking 41 million cars off the road. Since organic farming prohibits the use of synthetic fertilizer, this is part of how eating organically reduces your carbon footprint. Greenhouse gases are also released when clearing land for agriculture, whether it's slash and burn, for instance. In Indonesia, fires set to clear land for agriculture produced a haze that covered Southeast Asia and caused a surge in global emissions. Or traditional tilling, which disturbs sequestered carbon and releases it into the air as CO2. There are massive differences in the greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 calories of different foods. This is a chart showing CO2 equivalents. That's a way of equalizing the effects from carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., produced per 1,000 kilocalories. Now, a kilocalorie is the same as a calorie. The primary culprit is beef at 36.4 kilograms per calorie versus 0.28 for peas. But then, of course, dairy and cheese don't get off scot-free. That's why being a vegan trumps being a vegetarian. So, to summarize, you emit 2,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per year if you eat an average diet, 250 kilograms if you're a vegan. And what about water? Recall that 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are for agriculture. You're probably familiar with the idea that water will be the new oil over which wars are fought. And again, it's mainly animals and their products that are at the top of the charts for water use per calorie provided. Agriculture consumes 80% of the Colorado River's dwindling water supply. Take alfalfa. This crop consumes 15% of California's water, the largest percentage of the state's agricultural water use. And alfalfa is only used, you guessed it, to feed livestock, mostly cows. Not only does agriculture use water, it also pollutes it. This is a scene we are all familiar with, algal blooms or eutrophication. 80% of global ocean and freshwater eutrophication is caused by agriculture. About 60% of that is due to livestock production. It is estimated that 2/3 of applied fertilizer is excess. This excess nitrogen runoff causes overgrowth of algae, which ultimately ends up killing marine plants and suffocating fish. As you know, it can also be toxic to us. We see camp closings on our lake, and our city, whose water it supplies, closely monitors algae's cyanotoxin levels. Algal blooms can kill a small dog licking off its fur after going for a not-so-refreshing swim. The largest dead zone in the United States? About 6,500 square miles in the Gulf of Mexico. It occurs every summer as a result of nutrient pollution from the Mississippi River basin. The EPA reports that 1/2 of all rivers in the United States are unsuitable for aquatic life. 1/2, that's shocking. This quote from USGS: agriculture is the leading source of impairments in the nation's rivers and lakes. This is a graph showing the amount of eutrophying emissions per calorie of food produced. Once again, it's mainly due to livestock, including shrimp and fish, of course. Now, what about the ocean? First, greenhouse gas emissions don't just warm the air, they also warm the oceans. Oceans have absorbed 90% of the heat produced by greenhouse gas emissions, which is changing where fish can live, and it's contributing to coral bleaching. Also consider CO2 goes to 3 places. Half goes into the air, 1/4 is absorbed by the ocean, and 1/4 by land sinks, such as forests and soils. But the ocean becomes acidic when it absorbs CO2. Its acidity has increased 30% since the Industrial Revolution, and it's now apparent that this affects the ability of marine animals to form shells. For instance, phytoplankton eat shells. They produce half the oxygen we breathe, compose the base of the marine food chain, and hold almost the same amount of carbon as all CO2 sequestered by all land-based vegetation combined. Take these larger sea snails called pteropods. They are a main source of protein for sea life and are studied as they reflect ocean acidity. On the left, we have a healthy one. On the right, one showing effects of ocean acidification. The shell is opaque and ragged and has holes. This has obvious catastrophic consequences. This all begs the question, why do we eat so much meat, other than it tastes good? In most countries, meat is more expensive and a sign of wealth. But here, a burger is often cheaper than a salad. Why is that? Part of the reason is that subsidies funded by you and I to the tune of $38 billion yearly go largely to benefit livestock production. How much do you think goes to fruit and vegetables? 0.4%. I don't know why that is. Meat is also cheaper because we mass produce animals in CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. As you know, traditional farms are largely a thing of the past. For example, 98% of your pig products, bacon, and pork and sausage, are from these factory farms. So, what's missing? Where are the animals? Where are the pigs? They are behind bars. What is their crime? They're not cute. I was told I should pick my battles, but I also vowed I would never give a talk without a plea for pigs. These sows, female pigs who have an average intelligence instead of a 3-year-old child, are raised in these 2x7-foot gestation crates from 6 months old until they're slaughtered at 3 to 5 years after being continuously impregnated. They are never let out or see the light of day. They can't turn around. They can barely lie down. They would suffocate from the fumes of their excrement that drops through slatted floors if it weren't for giant fans. There are no federal animal welfare laws regulating their treatment. A few states have adopted some animal welfare regulations, but they only cover 3% of pigs. If we can just be conscious of what happens behind that final sanitized packing, we are so fortunate to have so many plant-based alternatives. A plant burger uses 99% less water, 93% less land, it produces 90% less greenhouse gas emissions, and it uses 46% less energy. Also, you don't have to become a vegan to make a huge difference. Anything we do to move in this direction helps. For example, substituting beans for beef meant 50% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions goal at the time of this study. Not eating meat or cheese 1 day a week would be the equivalent of taking 7 million cars off the road. And the most stunning example? Recently, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed that will pour billions into getting homes off fossil fuels, that's gas, propane, oil, and onto electricity, ultimately renewable clean electricity when the grids catch up. They're hoping this will electrify 1 million homes, but there are 140 million homes in the United States. So this truly blows my mind. According to a professor of environmental physics in Greta Thunberg's newest publication, The Climate Book, if we replaced just beef alone with a plant-based food, it would be the same as eliminating fossil fuels from 90% of all our homes. That's 90% of the entire U.S. residential sector. That's not 1 million. That's 126 million homes. Quote, "There are precious few actions that each of us could adopt on our own that would rival shunning beef in expected impact." End quote. And we didn't spend a penny. I think of buying produce for meals and plant-based meat and dairy products as a twofer. Boom! You just saved water, cleaned the air, reforested, reduced animal cruelty, and fed yourself more healthfully at the same time. You unweighted the side promoting global warming and simultaneously weighted the side invested in sustainable calories. Becoming more plant-focused does not mean this. We're talking meals like these: burgers, spaghetti and meatballs, chili, enchiladas, lasagna, pizza, stir fries, shepherd's pie. Especially with plant-based meat substitutes, the possibilities are endless. Speaking of which, you need good and easy recipes with available ingredients, or you will get very discouraged very quickly. Here's a few suggestions. You may know America's Test Kitchen. It's on PBS. Their motto is, "We make the mistakes so you don't have to." And the New York Times cooking section is also a great place to start. Although plant meat substitutes aren't perfect, we believe they're healthier than the animal products they replace. There's one I particularly like, however, and I want to give a shout out to. That's corn chicken patties. It's not made from corn, but a fungus, a mushroom. No saturated fat, a good amount of fiber. They lower blood sugar and bad cholesterol levels a bit. They contain excellent protein, are very satiating, and in particular this product, the chicken patties, taste very good. And they are available at most local supermarkets. Environmentally, they are a star. So back to the crux of the problem. 2/3 of us never talk about climate change. Why? Perhaps because we feel our actions are insignificant. Perhaps we feel ill-equipped to defend how vital it is to eat less meat, for instance. And there's a theory called solution aversion, where fear of a problem solution outweighs fear of the problem itself. The cure is worse than the disease. For example, I can't eat meat. I have to turn off my hot tub. I can't fly to vacations. Or if I can't buy things, our economy will tank. Or the government will tell me what to do. And we tend also to have what is called misplaced optimism bias. It will never be us to whom bad things happen. We assume that we have more control over circumstances than we do, thinking, A scientist will make a quantum leap discovery that will save the day, or our kids will be smarter and richer and figure it out. Or perhaps we believe world leaders will step up to the plate, but promises made at climate conferences have not become promises kept. Another reason, the media often initiates our conversations, and they are MIA, missing in action. Let's take this recent headline from the Washington Post in March 2023. The IPCC reported, "The world is on the brink of catastrophic warming." How many of you heard about it? Do you remember it? It should be shocking. So how did our major network TV stations report this most dire warning for all mankind? Well, ABC had 40 seconds, NBC had 30 seconds, CBS and Fox had a big fat zero. Basically, media ignored it. The unmistakable message? It must not be that important. The herd effect at its worst. It doesn't have to be this way. Look at the pivotal role media played in World War II. Media led the charge. Newspapers, radio, cinema, movies, they created awareness and urgency. Then the efforts of every citizen were called upon. This spirit was embodied by Rosie the Riveter. Everyone did whatever they could. It was a united action. For climate change, we need the same. My dad was a big smoker. I'm sure his doctor told him many times to quit, and he finally did. Years later, I asked him why. He looked at me straight in the eye and said, "Because you told me to." Me, his daughter, not me, a doctor. I became more vegetarian when my girls did in high school. Information is often not as persuasive as relationship. The heart often matters more than the head. Studies show the main reason we change is when those around us change, our tribe, our families, friends, and people we admire. And regarding climate change, although our individual actions may seem minuscule, what is huge is the impact we can have on others. How many get solar only once their neighbors did? Or buy a hybrid after your best friend raved about theirs? It's up to us, talking, sharing, spreading the word, working from the bottom up, together. I suspect we are all struggling. I certainly am. I'm only a vegan wannabe, and I'll continue to fly out west to see my kids. But we can't let pursuit of the perfect be the enemy of the good. None of us will start this journey if we feel the destination is unreasonable or unattainable, or we're traveling alone. Quote, "There are no important people fixing important problems. We are the best hope, a collective network of ordinary people." Katherine Hayhoe saving us. Hopefully, the end of the story isn't yet written. Hopefully, we still may be its authors, but our last chapter is soon to finish. So we need to talk. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Martin Luther King. Please, forward this video to everyone you feel may be interested. And thank you for taking the time to watch. The next video, Eating Less Meat to Heal Ourselves, will deal with the amazing health effects of eating more plant-focused meals. So stay tuned. My hope is these provide you with information so you feel more comfortable discussing the most pressing issue of our times, for our children's sake. Thank you again.